Today, we're breaking down the production behind Spotify's most streamed song and how you can apply its techniques into your own music. Because if you understand why Blinding Lights works, you can make better music yourself. I'm Martin, I've been producing music for over 14 years, and today I'm walking you through the production of Blinding Lights step by step because it's huge for a reason. It's a masterclass in modern pop production. And here's the best part, Blinding Lights is built from the same building blocks you'll find in almost every great pop song. Drums, chords, bass, melody, and effects. So stick around because by the end of this video you'll have the Blinding Lights blueprint and you'll know how to use it within your own tracks. So let's start with the drums. So first of all, let's set our tempo to 171 BPM, which sounds like this. And that's quite fast, right? But so will be our drums, because the drums in Blinding Lights are really what create all the energy and power in the record. And also they're very prominent, like they're really the backbone of the song. Because if you listen to Blinding Lights, you'll notice that the drums play in almost every section. So very important, but the great thing is that if we solo the drum samples, they're actually quite simple. For example, we have a Lin kick from the Lin drum machine. And then we have a snare consisting of two layers. We have this Lin snare and this 707 snare. And the best part is that these are actually FL Studio stock samples. So if you go to your sample browser, there is this folder called packs. So if we open that, we see this drums folder. And in there you can find a ton of great free samples like kicks. And that's where we actually got the Lin kick from. And then there's also a snares folder, which contains both the 707 snare and the Lin snare we're using, along with lots of other great snares. Like there is this very classical 808 snare, great for hip hop. And there's a 909 snare, for example, which is very similar to the snare used in Yes And by Ariana Grande, which is also a Max Martin production. Now, back to our drums. Here's what our drum loop sounds like. This is also very simple. So within each bar, we have 4 beats, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to place the kick on every first and third beat. So this is 1, 2, no kick, 3, kick, 4, no kick. And we'll copy paste that 4 times. So we get 4 bars of drums. And every 4th kick, we're going to add another kick right behind it. So that's over here. And that's how we get the following kick pattern. And for snares, it's really simple. We're going to have the snares play on every 2nd and 4th beat. So basically in between the pockets of the kick. And together they sound like this. Pretty simple, right? Now, if you listen closely, you'll notice there's a bit of reverb on every snare hit, sounding like this. And this is created with this plugin called Valhalla Vintage Verb, which is a paid reverb plugin. However, you can really use any reverb plugin here, such as Fruity Reverb 2, because the key is that the decay time, this little knob over here, is very short. In this case, less than half a second. And also the overall mix time should be quite low. So let me play you the snare without the reverb. Quite dry and dull, and now with. And this is a very 80s thing to do, just to make the snare sound a bit more atmospheric and alive. Now, while the kick and snare are the main drum elements in Blinding Lights, there are some other drum elements that are introduced at different points within the song. For example, these closed hi-hats. These often play in choruses just to add a bit of extra movement and energy. And there's also this crash, which also often plays at the beginning of the chorus to add some extra impact. And together those sound like this. Like if we play this without the crash, it definitely feels less impactful, right? So here's with the crash. Really tells the listener that, you know, something big is happening, something important is happening, like, hey, pay attention. And finally, there is this drum fill, which is often played at the end of a section to enhance the transition to the next section. And that sounds like this. Quite simple, yet extremely effective and energetic. And I'd say the main takeaway here is that You should really just look inside your DAW, inside its stock samples for drum sounds, because they're often very, very good. Okay, we talked about drums, which create the energy in the production. Now let's talk about chords, which create the emotion in the song. And we're gonna be using the following chords. We're gonna go from F minor, consisting of the notes F, G sharp, and C, to C minor, consisting of the notes C, D sharp, and G, to the home chord, which is going to be D sharp major, consisting of D sharp, G, and A sharp. Like, this chord makes you feel like everything's going to be alright. That's why I call it the home chord. Finally, we go to the fourth chord, which is the A sharp major chord, consisting of A sharp, D, and F. And together that sounds something like this in its most simple form. Pretty cheesy, right? And it may remind you of Time by Hans Zimmer from the movie Inception, which goes something like this. And that's because that one is using the exact same chord progression, but played in a different key. Okay, so now let's go back to Blinding Lights, and let's actually take a look at our chords in the piano roll. And you'll notice they sound and look slightly different from what we just played on the piano. So the major difference is that these are voiced differently. So what do we mean when we say voicing differently? Well, there's basically three ways of playing the same simple chord. Let's take F minor, for example, which we just played, which sounds like this. That's F, G sharp, and C. Now another way to play this would be by moving up the F by one octave, which would be this: G sharp, C, and F. So first we had this, and now we have this. Now there's a third way to play this, which would be by moving up the G sharp by one octave, which sounds like this. So these are our options. And all of these kind of sound a bit different in terms of tone and emotion they convey, especially in context of the full progression. Now you'll also notice that in the fourth chord we're playing, which is this A sharp major chord, we are adding an additional note, which is this D sharp. So let's play this without the D sharp. That sounds very perfect, right? And adding that D sharp, which is the fourth within that chord, adds a little more information and nuance to the chord, which just makes it feel a little more exciting and more intriguing. And finally, there is another trick being applied to this progression. Like, you often see a chord progression looking like this, where every chord starts exactly on the beat, which would sound something like this. Now instead, in Blinding Lights, we're actually having the chords play, actually the second and fourth chords play right before that beat, which is this. And that's really what contributes to the energy of the song, especially if you hear this in combination with the drums. But before we hear that, we have to look at sound design for a little bit, because this is a piano, and if you know Blinding Lights, you know Blinding Lights doesn't have a piano. It actually features 80s sort of synths. Something like this, basically. Exact same chords as the ones we just had on the piano, but much more exciting, right? And to get these chord sounds, we're using a plugin called Omnisphere. Specifically, it's two layers. We have this Power Pop Poly Comp synth, which kind of sounds a little bit voicey, you know, it has that like voice characteristic. And then the other preset we're using is the see-through brass preset, which definitely sounds more like an 80s synth, like an 80s brass. And together they create this kind of warm 80s atmospheric synth brass playing the chords. And then there's a final trick that helps convey more energy, which is adding a bit of sidechain to the mixer channel. And for this, we're using the plugin called Kickstart 2. And let me play you this sound without sidechain, so you may be able to tell what the sidechain is actually doing. So here's without. And here's with. If you listen carefully, the sound is kind of bouncing with the sidechain, going like this instead of just being like super static. And that's like a trick to apply to sounds to get them to sound more energetic, which is, you know, especially noticeable if we play them with our drums. Okay, so we talked about drums and chords, and the thing that makes sense to talk about next is the bass, because the bass is essentially following the root notes of the chords. So what does that mean? Well, remember the chords. We went from F minor, so that's root note F, to C minor, root note C, to D sharp major, root note D sharp, to A sharp major, root note A sharp. So in its very simplest form, this is our bass line. Now, to make our bass line slightly more interesting, intriguing, and also energetic, we're going to be adding some passing notes in between those root notes. So we're going to go from this to this. Then we go to D sharp. So instead of that, we're gonna do this. And finally, to transition back to the beginning of the bass line, we're gonna do this. So what we get is the following. Much more exciting than just playing those root notes, right? So let's now take a look at the sound design of this bass sound. In Serum, we essentially have two oscillators, which are both saw waves. And the thing that really adds the character to this is oscillator B. It has 10 voices of unison and quite a bit of detuning going on. So let's play the synth without oscillator B and with. Now, the other thing that really adds character to this is the fact that envelope 2 is controlling the filter, because without that, it sounds like this. Not great, right? Now, with that, it sounds like this. Adds that growl, right? And finally, we are applying some distortion on the effects channel. So without distortion, we get this. Not bad, but it's just slightly more aggressive with the distortion. And you can actually find this preset along with many other Serum presets, samples, loops, and session files in our Afterlight producer pack, which is linked in the description below. Now, to complement this more aggressive bass synth, especially in the low end, we're going to be adding this 808 sound, which sounds like this. A lot of low end, like a lot of bottom, right, which is awesome. And together they sound like this. So the 808 synth is also made in Serum and can also be found in our Afterlight producer pack. And it's really quite simple. It consists of an oscillator A, which is a sine wave, which sounds like this. And to make this sound more interesting and harmonic, we're adding oscillator B, which is this Digimon wavetable, which is actually modulating oscillator A. And that sounds like this. So before and after. And finally, we're again adding a bit of distortion. So here's without, and here's with. Again, just adding a lot of harmonics and just making this sound much more interesting. So let's give one more listen to how these two bass synths complement each other. We had the aggressive top bass sounding like this. And we have the harmonic 808 for the bottom end sounding like this. And here's the both of them together. And just like they complement each other, they definitely complement the chords and the drums because they really add a bit of aggression as well as this bottom end that just makes everything sound fuller. So here's everything together so far. Okay, so arguably the most catchy part of Blinding Lights is the melody. At least it's my favorite part of the song. And the reason why it works is because of the way it's structured. It follows this A-A-B-C structure. So what do I mean by that? Let me show you. We go from section A to A again, creating repetition to help you remember the melody. Like it's almost like it's asking a question, right? So then we go to the B part. We do that one more time. And then we resolve to C. So it's almost like a conversation, right? We go from A to A, repetition, asking the question, and then we have to resolve it. Like it has to go somewhere else. Like we can't leave this question open-ended. There needs to be something answering the question. And that's what the second half of the melody does by doing this. That's how it resolves, that's how it's structured, and that's why it works. And this is typical Max Martin melodic math. Like if you look at a Max Martin melody, you'll see structure being a huge role and call and response being a huge role. And that's why this works. So let's hear it in action. Okay, so let's get to the actual sound you hear. Again, we're in Serum, and again, the sound design is quite simple. So we're using two oscillators. Oscillator A is a saw wave with 4 voices of unison and a bit of detune sounding like this. So without the detuning, it sounds like this. So you definitely notice that the detune makes it sound much more wide and detuned. Now we're layering that with oscillator B, which is a square wave. This one has 3 voices of unison and also quite a bit of detune, and together they sound like this. But actually the main thing happening on this sound is being applied on the mixer channel, which is this Valhalla vintage verb, which adds a lot of atmosphere and reverb. So here's without, and here's with. Like it's really drenched in reverb, but instead of drowning you, it kind of wraps around you, which is pretty nice. And once again, this Serum preset is part of our Afterlight producer pack, which is inspired by The Weeknd, Mike Dean, Travis Scott. So if you like what you're hearing, definitely be sure to check that out. Now, here's what we get when we layer the melody with the chords and the bass and the drums. Okay, so far we really only talked about the core elements that make up the chorus and the hook. So when I say chorus, I mean the part when The Weeknd sings, "Ooh, I'm blinded by the lights," you know it. And that's where we actually play everything so far except for the melody lead. And this is typically followed by the hook, where we actually introduce the melody lead to the production. But obviously there's much more to the production than just the chorus and the hook, right? Like there's an intro, a verse, a pre, another verse, a pre, a small bridge, and then an outro at the end, really to play with the energy levels and to keep things interesting throughout. And a key element in the arrangement are effects. And when I say effects, I mean both like risers, impacts, stuff like that, as well as tonal elements like atmospheres and arpeggios, really to add some ear candy to make things sound more pleasant and interesting to the listener. So if we take a look at the intro, which is really only made of effects, and this is like a standalone section of just effects, so that sounds something like this. So what's really happening here is we have this liquid swell preset from Omnisphere, which is this softly detuned and subtly whirring synth belt, great for adding some high frequency interest to a track. So we're actually using it to add low frequency interest to a track, but it definitely just immediately sets the mood by creating this like huge bass drone. And on top of that, we're adding another Omnisphere preset, which is this sweeper pad. And this is heavily filtered and drenched in reverb and really just plays a couple of notes, but it definitely adds to the harmonic and melodic content of the intro, setting the mood. And to make things interesting, it's slowly gonna open up in terms of filtering. So that's really it for the intro, and actually we are using this transition to go from the intro to the hook, which is a riser we made ourselves using this FL Native plugin called 3x Osc. So we're really just setting all the oscillators to the noise one, and if we get rid of the filtering that's going on the mixer channel, we just get a simple noise sound with a bit of reverb. So what we're doing here is we're automating this little band over here. So what that's gonna do is it's gonna slowly open up the filter, and that's gonna create the little noise sweep we hear, which sounds like this. Which is a very simple yet extremely effective way to make your own risers. And that riser brings us to the hook, where we play all the elements I just played you, including the melody lead. And to make that impactful, we already said we are adding a crash sample, but we're also adding this clap sample as an exhaust, and it has a lot of reverb to make the hook sound extra impactful. And then we go to the first verse, and this is where one of my favorite production elements of the song is introduced, which is this arpeggio. And if we break this down, this is really just playing the C minor chord. So we go from C to D sharp. We're also playing the G, which are the three notes that the C minor chord is made up of. And in between, we're playing one F to just keep things a little more interesting melodically. And the filter of this arpeggio is slowly opening up as we go through the verse to really start building toward the next section. And that sounds something like this. And in that next section, the pre-chorus, we are adding another very cool element, which is again an arpeggio, and that sounds like this. So this is slightly more complex melodically, but the sound itself is very aesthetically pleasing, I think. And it's actually made up of two layers. The first one sounds like this. So kind of sounds like this trance plug, and it's from this plugin called Spire. And the second layer sounds like this. So this is from Serum, and it's really like adding a little bit of high-end sparkle because it has a bit crush effect on it, which actually sounds like this without the bit crush effect and with. See, it just adds a little bit of crispiness, which makes the overall arpeggio sound more interesting. So this arpeggio really helps us build to the chorus where we can sing, "Ooh, I'm blinded by the lights." And in the second half of that chorus, we are introducing the analog power sweep pad from the intro again. You know, in the intro, it was just playing a couple of notes. And now it's adding this like extra pad almost to add some melodic content to the chords and the melody, and that sounds like this. So what's happening here? Remember our chord progression went from F to C to D sharp to A sharp. And we're really playing a combination of thirds and fifths of these respective chords. So in the F minor chord, we're playing the third, the minor third, which is G sharp. In the C minor chord, we're playing the 5th, which is G. Then in the D sharp major chord, which is the home chord, we're playing the major 3rd, G. And finally, in the A sharp major chord, we're playing the 5th again, which is the F. And this is actually a very effective trick for melodies. If you're trying to figure out what notes to use for your melody, it often is very effective to follow the chords and then especially use either the 3rd or the 5th of that chord, because if you play that in the melody, it'll basically instantly sound good. So after the chorus and the second hook, we go to the second verse where we again introduce the arpeggio. Then in the pre-chorus that follows, we add both the interesting crispy arpeggio and this like analog pad we just discussed. Then we go to the second chorus where we play all the elements we had discussed so far, you know, drums, chords, bass, melody. We're again in the second half introducing our little like extra melodic pad. And then to transition in this like small bridge section, we're actually doing something new by adding a new transition and riser. And that is actually very, very cool because it's a melodic riser and it sounds like this. So this effect really consists of two elements. We have this like little uplifting thing that basically just is pitching up one octave. Then it's staying there, kind of like an atmosphere effect in the bridge, and it goes down. And the second element is this arpeggiating harp synth, which sounds like this. So that's playing a lot of notes in a very short period of time. But what's really happening here is it's taking the F minor chord, so the notes F, G sharp, and C, and it's just playing those in an upward fashion. So we go from and doing that like super fast to get this very cool effect. So I definitely think this is quite a refreshing way to transition from one section to the other, as it's like this very cool melodic arpeggiating riser, which you don't hear that often in pop music. So very cool. Then to transition into the third hook, we're again using this tonal pitch riser, but now we're pitching it up over the course of 2 octaves. So it's a little more dramatic, which sounds like this. And then there's really one last transition into the outro. And in context of the actual production, that like final part sounds like this. And that's it. Steve Jobs once said, simple can be harder than complex, and Blinding Lights really shows that less is more. If you focus on mastering these 5 core elements, drums, chords, bass, melody, and effects, you're on your way to becoming a great music producer. Now, subscribe for more videos like this and grab the Afterlight pack while you can if you want to make pro-level music. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.